there we go, the recording has started now. Hi, I'm Kat. I'm talking a bit about exploring and interpreting your data. So there's a vast amount of information that we get from bioacoustic data because there's really, really high resolution information, and that can be quite daunting. So I'm just going to give a little overview of ways to start approaching that. So I'll be covering designing an avian bioacoustic survey because we are focused on birds at the moment with welder sensing. So that will be the primary focus of my talk. Integrating alongside traditional methods, exploring your data, refining your data, what stories are there to be told, and then further investigations that you can have. Obviously, some of this has been covered already, so I will go through that as briefly as I can, just to reinforce really. So the foundations of good data and good information and outputs is designing a solid survey. A lot of this has already been covered, but just to reinforce that when you have designed your survey in a specific way, if you've got a specific target species, a specific sample rate, that's going to influence how you interpret and display your data, or the stories that you can gain from your data. So you really want to keep that in mind when you start to look at the outputs of your surveying. It's as Jeff touched upon, it's really important to integrate alongside traditional methods. This is an additional tool, and the ground truthing we get from having boots on the ground is really, really important. With bioacoustics, obviously, you're only picking up the species that vocalize, and there's an awful lot that you could miss otherwise. You also have the potential to pick up some really interesting species. So through validation and through ground truthing, that can really improve and reaffirm the quality of the data that you're collecting. You do want to decide whether your traditional methods are overlapping or in addition. So do you want to line up your surveying to reaffirm what you're getting from your in-person surveying, or do you want to see what else is going on, and that will influence the design that you use and how you interpret your data again, but that all comes back to your original survey intention. You also want to look at other relevant information. If you're looking at causality or correlation with other things that are going on, you probably want to make sure that your other data sources, whether it's dip wells, climate data, weather data, that they can be reasonably placed alongside where you've got your audio recorders. The best way to really describe how to start getting going with this is to have a little demo. So I will change screen briefly and show you some of the data we have. So there are many, many threads to pull on, particularly if you're recording 24/7. So you can do subsets. You can do your 1 minute sampling, 10-minute sampling. But if you are recording 24/7, that gives really high resolution information. And as I say, that can be really daunting. There's no current official recommended methodology for exploring or refining your data. So I'm just giving a bit of an overview of some of the methods you might want to use and some of the considerations that you should take into account. So this is within our data dashboard. I'm showing data here from 4 recorders that are from the same site. And these recorders have been out for about 2 years now, but I'm just showing the time range of the whole of last year, 2023. I've currently got all species selected, and the other things that need to be taken note of before we really go exploring is the detection confidence, which is the confidence that the machine learning algorithm has that it's correctly identified a species. And the location probability is a filter that's put on to basically say how likely is this species in this location on this week of the year. This is based on eBird data. It can be a slight limitation because it does negatively impact underreported species, and I'll illustrate that in a little bit. A good starting point is generally about 0.85 for detection confidence, usually around 0.1 for the location probability. And then we can just have a little look and see what's going on. This graphic here shows the number of calls that's been picked up in that period, and it's really need to reinforce that these are the call numbers that we're working with. We're not working with abundance here in terms of the number of animals that are actually present, and that will influence how we're interpreting the data too. If we look, have a quick look through the calls per recorder, you can start to get an idea of site usage of different species. You can also start to have a look at some of the species that are being picked up. So we're automatically getting some spurious things here that you know, indicate you might want to go away and validate some of these. And some other, you start to get an idea of some of the species richness and assemblage that you've got at site. And from this, you can look at certain things, like if we look at the Chetty's warbler, you can see a really distinct preference, location preference within the site towards primarily this one recorder area. Absolutely no recordings at the other, at this location for the whole of the year. You start to build up a little picture of site usage and habitat types and how they vary across the site. Also get some low figures going on. Start to inquire into what that might mean, whether the species are present, whether they're migrating, and what their other general behavior is. And we can look at the call frequency by time of day. So as you'd expect, generally around dawn, this is for the whole year, so the dawn does shift within this, obviously, but you can get a bit of a picture of what's going on across the whole of the year. And counts per day, this is really quite interesting. This is across all species, and you can see that there are some days that have, so this doesn't show the whole of the year, but for a lot of November and December last year, there are distinct days that have a lot more calls than others. Now, if you do have other data sets like your weather and climate data, it'd be interesting to see if these kinds of things are correlating with that. And we can look at the number of records by time of day and month. So what we see here, really illustrated pretty well, is the dawn chorus. So these relate to the months of the year. So this pink and this blue, we've got May and June, with really much higher numbers of dawn chorus calls, and around when you'd expect. Start to see an overall picture of what's calling the most. And this might be expected, it might be unexpected, it might give you things to explore further on in your data. Here, this is a little bit crunchy, but we've got the species by recorder. This is quite granular, so it's day by day. For this site, it isn't too dissimilar from this overview. Some sites, you get really distinct and clear illustration of particular sites having much higher richness or much lower richness, which might indicate that you want to go away and have a look at the assemblage makeup of those particular sites. As I say, there's lots of threads that you could pull on to go into this data. So you want to maybe have a look at some of the individual species as well. Now, I know from having had a look at this before, and I've highlighted as well the Chetty's warbler here. Jeff's mentioned it already, but we'll have a little look within this. Should be coming up for us now. And you can really see this distinct upswing of calls around 3-4 a.m. So this is across the whole of the year. And then if we go down to across the whole of the year and which months it is, we can tell that that's over April and May. They're being really, really active. As Ella mentioned, this is something she started to pick up. It's something we started to pick up at a few different sites. So it's new information for many of us, but talking to ecologists from around the world, this isn't new behavior. Particularly in Spain, I can't remember the original Spanish name, but But in Spanish, the translation of their nickname is the bastard nightingale, because of how early and how frequently they call, so early in the morning during the spring. But there's a lot of behavior that we don't know hiding within this overall data set. I think that's a really exciting thing with 24-hour recording and getting those species identifications is if we pull on all those different threads, we will find these behaviors that we didn't know about. So if you are looking at a target species and you already got some reasonable data, you know how to design your survey around that, but we don't know what we don't know. So it's always worth having a deeper explore. I mentioned that the location probability can be a little bit of a limitation due to underreported species. This is something that we're looking to change based on that limitation. But I'll illustrate how that's working for the time being. So if I find the tawny owl, so it's currently showing as no data found. So we know from ground truthing and from traditional surveys that they are there. So if we start to bring the location probability down, we start to get the identification. So this is an underreported bird on eBird, to illustrating the fact you really do need to have a little play around with these settings to get the most out of your information. And actually we'll find as well that if we improve the detection confidence, there's still really high numbers of detections of tawny owl. The machine's really confident that it's getting these right. It's just the location probability that's blocking it off in that other instance. Let's bring that back down to 0.85. And you can also sense check that if you think there might be a species that isn't showing particularly well because of the location probability, you can use other graphics that we have here, because graphics are a really nice way to digest your data really quickly and easily. Looking at the call hour by time of day for tawny owl, it's showing entirely overnight, which indicates, yeah, these detections really are probably very accurate. So if I move back to my slides. There are things to consider before we use that data that we've explored to tell stories or to do our reporting. We need to think about what species confidence and what location probability is most relevant for the information and story that you're trying to tell. What's most relevant for the species that you're looking at if you have a target species. Obviously, that'll be different for a tawny owl to perhaps a Chetty's warbler. And you want to validate as well. It's really important, validating through ground truthing, but also our system produces time-stamped audio files that are labeled. So you can go directly back to those and listen. So the data is completely auditable. So checking by listening is a really important feature. We can also use that to refine the data a bit more. So say you're looking at something like species richness. You probably want to cut out the really spurious things. So say here we've got the bar-tailed godwit, only had one call for the whole of the year. You can go away and listen to it and validate it. This recording, I know from experience, isn't a bar-tailed godwit. And we've also got things like the bearded reaving, the bearded tit. We know they're in the area, but only one recording. Probably go away and validate it. That begs the question if they're all of those one or two handful of detections across a long period of time are all coming back as negative in the validation. Do we want to bring in other systems to refine our data? Perhaps you want to have a species number, a species call number threshold. And this will be dependent on how long your deployment has been, how long your recorders have been out, and again, the question that you're asking with your monitoring. But do you say all species with fewer than 5 calls over that period, do we just immediately discount them? Perhaps it's higher, perhaps it's lower. The slight limitation with that, it does speed up your process, but there will be species that you probably remove that are there that don't vocalize as much. So obviously all of our species have different call rates, and this does lend itself towards, perhaps it'd be really nice if somebody did a lovely study of expected call rates of different species, and they would have some really nice prescribed cutoffs for those. But you can sense check your data to what you think those might be if you haven't got the time to go away and validate every single species that you have on site. It's also if you are refining your data, to think about what you're studying and what you're looking at. Are you looking at resident species? Are you getting a really solid baseline of species richness? In which case you probably do want to get rid of those spurious detections pretty quickly. Or you're looking at migrants passing through, in which case if you're only getting 1 or 2 calls, you don't want to be removing those from your data. And really importantly, we want to be using this to tell stories. Data is absolutely fantastic. In terms of science, it is completely vital to get proof and evidence for proving that what we're doing is making a difference, or proving that there's something that needs to be fixed, or the correlations between things. But if we're working with volunteers or trying to get members on board, or trying to get interest in what we're doing and support for what we're doing, we really need to make these stories accessible and relatable, and understandable. So once you've found your story, or you've pulled on your thread within your data, you want to flesh it out and visualize it. P-values are really, really important, but the general public don't really know much about statistical analysis. But if you show them a really nice clear graph, it tells so much more of a story, and will get more people on board. So you want to use that data to its advantage by creating interesting stories. I've already spoken about the bastard nightingale, as you can see here, but you can look at things like the impacts of climate change, say, on migrant species. So I haven't actually got the graph of this here, but for certain sites, if you plot the cuckoos with dunnocks and whitethroats, you can see that there's a shift in their first call rates throughout the year, which would suggest things like the dunnock are breeding successfully before the cuckoos have arrived and have a chance to parasitize them, which means that they're focusing more onto the other migrant species. And we can get these illustrations and find out what's going on. We can also look at things like year-on-year information. I haven't got much of that to show you yet because we haven't had much of a chance to get year-on-year information yet, but it should start to show us some interesting things. So at this site here, seeing really clear change in the assemblage already. Initially declines, but then the assemblage is changing. If you look at the assemblage, what is that telling us? So yeah, you want to find your stories and illustrate your stories for the correct audience. And there's further exploration to be done as well. As I've said, it's call data that we're working with rather than abundance. So species richness is a really good way to start to quantify your data. And looking at assemblage, you can begin to get a picture of what kind of habitat, what kind of quality of habitat that you're looking at. Maybe you're looking at against national indexes or index species lists, or perhaps you have a target species. The species assemblage can tell you an awful lot about a site. Things like beta diversity, looking at the difference in the richness and the assemblage between different locations within a single site, can tell you how variant the habitat is. So these are changes year on year at this site between different recorders. A lot of them are very, very similar, but this point here, we can see there's a huge change from year to year in how different the sites have got more different from each other. So what's that telling us about how interventions have impacted those habitats? So year-on-year information is really illustrative of those kinds of changes. Seasonal behavior, as I say, with the cuckoo, there's lots of different stories you can get there. Time series analysis, because I showed you the dashboard and the graphics of the data. Obviously, that's underpinned by time-stamped and date-stamped species identifications. And if you're recording 24/7, you have a huge amount of information there about the change rates and the call rates. So there's an awful lot that you could go into if you have the time and the inclination. And yeah, the number of people to really get the information out of that. And obviously looking alongside any other data sources that you have to really pinpoint those correlations is really important. I'm going to misquote someone entirely here, and I can't remember who it was, but somebody said we've won the in terms of the climate and biodiversity crisis. We've won the science battle, but we're losing the communications war. So we really want to work at using this really rich, really vital, really important data to tell those stories and bring people on the journey with us to do the best that we can to turn things around. So in summary, with bioacoustics, you really want to make sure that your survey is relevant to your requirements and to your survey design. You want to ground truth and correlate with on the ground and traditional methods. Explore your data before really refining it. Validate any unusual, interesting detections, refine your data, and find and tell those stories. Thank you.